So thank you all for joining us, both here in person in sunny Corvallis and from around the nation. It looks like we have folks in the chat, so they're here from Alaska and Florida, New York, California. So thank you all for joining us, being with us today for our latest FURst Aid event. These are a series of hybrid events for animal lovers to learn practical skills for their pets and other animals that they have in their care. So my name is Jens Odegaard. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications here at the Carlson College of Veterinary Medicine. And our mission here at the college is to advance the health of animals, people, and the environment through inclusive and equitable education, research, and service to the public. We have 331 students, roughly. So we have a new class coming in right now. 300 are studying for their doctorates of veterinary medicine, and 31 are graduate students in our comparative health sciences program. The college serves the public with research and diagnostic services through our Lois Bates Atchison Veterinary Teaching Hospital and Oregon Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory. A few housekeeping notes for today's presentation. For those of you online, at the bottom of the screen is a chat box for your question, or you can use the Q&A function. And for those of you here in person, please hold your questions to the end. We'll get to as many as we're able to. So we've built in plenty of time for those at the end, I think. I'd now like to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Jennifer Sargent is an Oregon State alumna, earning her doctorate of veterinary medicine in 2011. She did a small animal internship at a private practice in Rochester, New York for a year before returning to campus, first as a resident, then as a clinical veterinarian for the campus, and now as the attending veterinarian for the entire university. In this role, she ensures the health and safety of all animals owned by the university. She's also an instructor here in the college teaching pocket and exotic animal medicine. She's also a founding member of the college's disaster action management team, DAM Vets, which is dedicated to providing disaster and emergency response training and preparedness education to the public, as well as veterinary professionals. So please help me welcome Dr. Sargent.
There we are. Now we've got the audio back. All right. Yes. Thank you all for coming today to hear about disaster preparedness, whether that's virtually or in person. I want to start today with a little poll and see what kind of pet and animal species you're all representing as animal owners, so that we can learn a little bit about our audience today. One of the things that I really love about my job and what gets me out of bed in the morning is that I get the opportunity to work with a very wide variety of species, alpacas to zebrafish and a little bit of everything in between. And in that role, one of my duties is to help the animal care staff come up with emergency and contingency plans for all those different animals. So I hope to share some of that expertise.
It looks like we've got 72 cats, 137 dogs, 17 household pets, 16 horses, 7 cattle, 10 goats, 4 sheep, 4 swine, 24 poultry, and 9 other.
All right. Excellent. We got a great variety of animals. Plays right to my interest. So I decided to make this my title slide because this is a picture of my daughter and one of our dogs playing in the yard. And I think it kind of strikes to the heart of, the importance of animals and disaster preparedness. Not that long ago, animal preparedness in relation to disasters was at best an afterthought, if not actively discouraged, because the thought was that by worrying about the animals, we're not dealing with the human toll, the human needs at the time, if we're wasting those efforts on animals, which we've come to realize that is absolutely the wrong way to think about it. And disasters like Katrina really put that in sharp focus, that by not attending to the animal needs, that we had people that refused to evacuate, we had people that would go back into unsafe areas to rescue their animals. And so preparing our animals for a disaster is an important part of just community preparedness as a bigger picture, and that helping the animals helps the people as well. The other thing I like about this picture is, I think it captures that human animal bond essence pretty well. And some of the groups that are considered the most vulnerable in disasters, so families with young children, folks who live in mobile homes, the elderly, have all been groups that are considered particularly vulnerable in disasters. They're also well represented, if not overrepresented, in the pet owner population. So one of my hopes is that by talking about disaster preparedness in the frame of animals, that it can be a gateway, if you will, to larger scale disaster preparedness for the humans that are attached to all those animals, including some of those that may be relatively vulnerable in disasters. Trouble advancing. There it goes. All right, so we'll start with just a little roadmap. We're going to talk about some fundamentals for disaster preparedness, general preparation for animals of all species, and then we'll talk through some strategies for different types of animals with some examples, particularly dogs, cats, pocket pets and exotics, and farm animals. And then we will leave plenty of time for question and answer. So animals need their people. The first bit of this is going to talk about disaster preparedness tips that really don't have all that much to do with animals. So I think it's safe to say there's probably an audience of mostly animal lovers on the line, and that's great. But stick with me for sort of the human preparedness part, because it's important to be prepared yourself so that you have the bandwidth to take care of your animals in a disaster. Kind of like when you're on an airplane and they tell you to put your oxygen mask on before assisting others. Same thing kind of applies in the disaster scenario in terms of being able to help your animals. So the first thing you need to do is make a plan. And so there are some really great online resources that go really step by step on how to make a plan, which brings me to one of the real themes I hope to convey during this talk, and that is that there are a lot of resources out there. And just being aware of them is half the battle, and being able to find what you need. There's great resources for setting up a first aid kit or making a plan. And we'll include some links on the last couple of slides. Those will be available online so that you can capture them there. You don't need to frantically start writing them down when you see them for screen capturing, but you'll have access to those resources, and I encourage you to use them. My hope is to inspire and create awareness that those resources exist so that you feel empowered to tap into them. So when making your plan, there are great detailed things you can start going through. There's also, start with the simple stuff, cherry pick the easy stuff. So talk with your family about where you'd meet for whatever reason you couldn't meet at the house. Say there was a gas leak and you had to find somewhere else that would be a convenient meeting point. Or if you had to communicate but cell phones weren't available, is there a family member that's out of town that would be your logical point of contact? So just start with some basic kind of communication things as part of your plan, as well as thinking about sort of the things you'd need to have in order to support that plan, whether that's radios or flashlights or the different kind of support things that'll get you around what's missing. So I really like this quote when it comes to disaster preparedness, because the idea is that no matter how good a job you do trying to plan for every contingency, at the end of the day, the plan, the written plan on paper, at some point you're probably going to have to go off book. Disasters are ever changing. There's all sorts of nuances. And I think back to the 2020 wildfires, and it was not just wildfire response, but it was wildfire response overlaying a pandemic response. So some of the congregate sheltering and other things that we normally have a script for, we had to flip the script and do something differently because things change and there are indirect effects of disasters that can't always be planned for. And so while this quote was uttered in the context of war strategy and planning, I think it also applies very well to disasters. And maybe worthless is a strong word, but the real value of the planning isn't so much the paper plan that you have in your hand at the end, but going through the thought process of how you deal with the different twists and turns that life could throw at you, and building a framework that can then guide you through how you manage those. All right, and so as part of your plan, think about the context in which you'll have to execute it. So know what kind of disasters are common in your area. I'm very pleased to see that we have an audience from all over the country as well as here locally. And the kind of disasters that you plan for are going to change somewhat depending on what region of the country you're in, or even just what your neighborhood and local community looks like. So, and part of that too, not just thinking of weather hazards, but think a little bit about what's in your area that could create challenges for response. Are you in a very rural area where response times are necessarily somewhat slow? I think of growing up in a small town on the coast. Most of us lived in one place, but worked in the slightly larger town across the bay, and that meant going over a bridge every day. If there was some sort of disaster that took out the bridge, what was the contingency plan? If your pet was at home when the bridge was inaccessible, who could you reach out to that would be on the right side of the bridge to take care of your animals, that sort of thing. Also, take advantage of the community communication tools that are out there. Often these are at a county or city level, and they will provide text or email or phone notifications to tell you what's going on. These are particularly useful for local things like gas leaks or bad traffic accidents that are going to block a road for a period of time, as well as the larger scale natural disaster type hazards. There are also national apps from different disaster response organizations. So FEMA has one, Red Cross has one. I'm sure there are others. I'm not endorsing any particular one, but the idea is there's lots of apps out there that can kind of help create that sort of larger regional scale awareness. I personally have a FEMA app, and right now it just gave me a high temperature alert for the coming weekend. And so they can be handy for that and keeping you aware of what's coming in a weather context. Other thing I want to highlight is the idea of a watch versus a warning. So once you're plugged into your different community resources, understand the lingo so you know what they're telling you. So for a watch versus a warning, a watch means basically all the ingredients are there for that hazard to occur. It's possible and you should be prepared. Whereas a warning means those ingredients have already been assembled. In this case, or an example, of flood is happening or isn't about to happen. And so you need to start taking action. So that's the difference between a watch and a warning, which is important for your situational awareness. So the other part of the lingo, most of your state or higher level responses will have some sort of evacuation communication or notification system. Oregon, so this is from the Oregon Office of Emergency Management. Just as an example, they have a 3-tiered evacuation notice with a level 1, where you're basically just in preparation mode. Level 2, you need to be set, be ready to go at a moment's notice. So kind of next level, you have your plan, you have all the stuff. Now all you need to do is go, which leads you to level 3, which is the go now. This is effectively mandatory evacuation territory where it's unsafe to stay and you need to go immediately. And so states may vary in how they communicate this or what terminology they use, but my guess is most has something that is some variation on this theme. A couple notes about this. I think as humans, we like to think that everything goes in an orderly 1, 2, 3. One of the more memorable stories I heard about the wildfires was that this couple had gone to bed. When they went to bed, there was no notification. They were woken up by their dog barking. They look up and the hill above them was on fire. And so it went from effectively level 0 to level 3 immediately in the middle of the night, which I say not to scare people, but to put it in context of the limitations of what these levels tell you. They're based on the best information that's always changing. And so be practical if you know there are certain limitations to your ability to evacuate quickly. Factor that into the plan. So, for example, if you're talking about larger animals, or especially multiple larger animals, that you're going to have to make multiple trips with a horse trailer to move, factor those multiple trips in. So maybe it makes more sense to relocate at level 2 instead of waiting for a level 3 evacuation, because immediately it may be hard for you to accomplish in the context of your personal scenario. And so that should be factored in. The other thing to think about too is, if especially we're talking about larger animals, do you want to be driving that horse trailer or stock trailer in the middle of heavy evacuation traffic, particularly if roads are narrow? So again, think about your personal circumstances and the limitations of your region, and consider where in those levels makes the most sense for you to leave. So now that you've got your plan, now you need the stuff to execute your plan. So regardless of what species we're talking about, all creatures need food. They need water and a way to drink it, depending on what species we're talking about. That may be a bucket, that may be a water bottle, but everybody's going to need water. They need the access to medications they take regularly, and a first aid kit is recommended. And when I say first aid kit, I think a lot of people immediately jump to this idea of sort of a Red Cross CPR, splinting the leg kind of level of first aid. But sometimes a lot of the things that you're going to need are going to be really simple. Some saline flush, or if your pet gets smoke or ash in its eyes, basic effective grooming supplies. So if your dog has to walk through flood water and needs a bath at the end of that, you have what you need to do that. So a lot of personal care items go a long way in first aid without feeling like you have to be set up some sort of MASH style unit wherever you go. All creatures also need some paperwork to go with them. Veterinary records are good. Vaccination records are especially important. Things like rabies vaccination, or other types of immunizations that are important for interstate travel if you needed to leave the region to stay with friends or family or that sort of thing. Having your records with you can be really helpful. A picture of you and your animals together. So this is a picture of me and my neurotic beagle mix, Cinder. And that is helpful for if there was a situation where we weren't together and we needed to be reunited. This effectively acts as proof of ownership. No, there's no question that that is my dog. So that is helpful, as well as the identification tag you see. So we'll talk a little bit about the different ways that we can identify different types of species. Dogs are fortunately really convenient in the sense that they are pretty tolerant of collars and tags, so take advantage of that. And care instructions. So in the example I mentioned previously, where my family lived across the bridge, if somebody had to jump in and we had to delegate care because we were unavailable, having care instructions as part of your kit is really helpful, so that somebody can pick up where you left off, provide that continuity of care, especially if there are medications or other things that are somewhat nuanced or complicated. Having those written instructions there for somebody to follow can be very helpful. This is a screenshot I stole from a webinar on wildfire preparedness, but what I want to point out, what I love about it is, I guess for background, if you have 5 minutes to pick up and evacuate, what 3 things do you take with you was the prompt. And you can see everybody's responses. The more a response was given, the bigger text it is. And what I took away from it was the 3 things that people usually leave with are the living things in their life, a purse or wallet, and their cell phone. And so I like this as a reminder to use your cell phone in your emergency planning. I keep a photo album labeled in my phone that's pet preparedness, and it's pictures, those pictures I talked about with you and your pets. I have a couple that are good identification pictures that I'll show later that just maybe highlight their unique markings or something. It's also very handy for some of your records. If you have the time to go back and grab your paper records or your complete go bag, great. But even if you don't, and all you got away with your phone, if you snapped pictures of your vaccination record or the vet invoice at the end of that visit where they got their vaccinations or that kind of information, then at least you have the light version of your paperwork on your phone with you wherever you end up. So now I'll dive into the species specific part a little bit. And so so dogs are the template species for most of the disaster preparedness documentation you'll come across, which is great for dog owners. So accordingly, I'm going to give them relatively little airtime here because basically all your references will cover it in a lot more depth than I could do justice to in this half hour. But a few things I do want to highlight. So have a crate and a leash and collar, even if, on one end of the spectrum, you have these teeny tiny dogs that hardly ever touch the ground, let alone never go in a crate. You still want to have a crate as part of your go kit because depending on where you end up setting up shop while you're evacuated, you may need a controlled, safe environment where you could have them safely contained. So having that crate is really helpful. On the other end, where you have these dogs that are very reliably off-leash loyal followers, now is not the time to put to test their off-leash skills during a disaster. You want to make sure that you have a leash and collar just for that extra layer of security, a literal lifeline in case you need that extra layer of control and protection for your pet. As I mentioned before, dogs are really good about wearing ID tags on their collar. Take advantage of that. Microchips are also great for identification. I recommend having both. The benefit of the ID tag, it's just so immediate. If you come across a dog that's wandering without a person, just about anybody can read that, call the number and get in touch with an owner, whereas a microchip requires maybe a trip to a vet or shelter to get it scanned and can be very effective. Can't fall off like a collar, but it's more delayed. So the two identification methods are pretty complementary in that sense. So this is an example of my pup and his go kit. So this is my dog Coco, and this is one of the pictures that's in my album because it kind of nicely shows that T-shaped white mark on his chest that might be important for identification or reunification. And this is his bag. I usually use the crate as part of the storage, so you can't really see it, but there's food bowls and other items in there, as well as the first aid kit in the backpack, which is on top. If you were watching that sort of welcome screen, that first aid kit that's laid out on the table is what's in that bag, minus the cow. So, and for cats, they can be a little bit more challenging. As most of you know from your trips to vet with the cats, they don't always like to cooperate when it comes time to go places. Add to that, they may be indoor, outdoor only. So it can be variable where you find them, and they tend to hide when they're scared. When I first moved into my house, I think I saw my cat like maybe once for the first week. She was just in hiding mode because she was a scaredy cat in general. But in a disaster, they'll pick up on the stress, they'll pick up on things that are going on, and it's more likely that they'll hide, and that can be a challenge for owners. So a few strategies to kind of mitigate these challenges. One thing I like to recommend to folks is reimagine the feeding routine. Think about providing the food maybe in a crate or a kennel, or at least a small room, somewhere that's relatively enclosed, where they can get used to associating with it something positive like their daily meal or a twice daily meal. And so it becomes less scary, less foreign. And it gives you an option if you need to evacuate them when they go in for their normal meal, close the door behind them and they're contained for their safety and for easy evacuation. Think about starting early as you are getting everything together to leave or getting everything prepped. The more things start to look unusual, the more likely they're going to go into nervous hiding mode. So think about getting the cat early in the packing process. And also because they like to hide or maybe outdoors when the disaster occurs, think about the reunification logistics. So again, we talked about collars and tags for dogs. So we're pretty good about wearing them. Cats, you can get them little breakaway collars, but cats are variably good at wearing them. So microchips become even more important for cats. And the key with a microchip is register it, please. There are a few things more frustrating than scanning a pet, finding they have a microchip and knowing and not having contact information that's associated with it or current. So that's your homework. As a true academic, I must assign some homework next time your cat goes to the vet. Confirm that microchip and that it's registered. The other thing I recommend with microchips is use that secondary contact for somebody who's out of the area. So, for example, if like during the 2020 wildfires, there were a number of cats that the cat was still around in the neighborhood, but the home was no longer there. And so the way to contact the owner might not be the same as it was before the fire. But if you have an out of the area friend or family member as that secondary contact, there's a better chance that that person will be contacted and you'll be looped back in and you'll be able to be reunited with your pet. Small mammals and exotic pets, I'm thinking of things like rabbits, mice, chinchillas, ferrets, as well as some of the non-furry critters. So like the bearded dragon pictured here, or some of our avian common pets. So typically these guys are small, and so moving the animal is actually not that hard. It's all their stuff. They usually have special husbandry requirements. They need heating, they need special food, they need special bedding, etc. So make sure to have a plan for all those extra husbandry items. I generally recommend putting them in a small, secure travel carrier for the actual movement from point A to B, and then have a plan for sort of their longer term housing. Once you get to point B, what are they going to live in for days or weeks? And so in some cases that can be their normal day-to-day habitat that you just pack up. However, a lot of times when you're doing a good job with these species, their day-to-day setup can be pretty elaborate and pretty big. I'll show some examples. And so it's helpful to have like an intermediate size for shorter term housing. Already mentioned special husbandry considerations. You may have to get more creative with their identification. They're probably not going to wear tags or collars. Some may be microchip amenable, but you may have to get more creative. One thing I recommend, like for my what I do for my hedgehog, have an ID card that would go on their carrier that includes a picture of me with the hedgehog, so that it's clear that the two things go together. Oh, and the other thing is that they may not be welcome everywhere, and not every shelter, emergency shelter, is going to have good capacity for these unusual species. They'll try their best, but the tools they have on hand may not be very amenable. This is a picture of my hedgehog with his go kit. He has what looks like a unibrow because he is an endearingly grouchy little guy, and he did not want to be woken from his nap for a picture. This is his regular habitat. It's pretty big. You can see that's his little carrier on top of it. That's his regular home. So in a disaster, what we plan to do is empty out the stuff from his enclosure, use it as effectively a tote, put other bags and things in it, put him in the travel carrier, and then we reassemble his home once we got to wherever we were going. So that's one way to approach it. This is my colleague's gecko setup. So she has a similar little travel carrier, is special husbandry supplies, but also this is more of an intermediate housing situation. And it's really just a tote that's had the top cut out and replaced with screen for ventilation. So would this be great permanent housing for months or years? Probably not, but for a few days or even a few weeks on the road while you're trying to get resettled somewhere, that could make a big difference for them. So some general farm animal considerations. As a veterinarian, I love the idea that a pygmy goat is a large animal and a Great Dane is a small animal, right? But really often we're talking about indoor versus outdoor. And for your farm animals, the outdoor component, it's important to factor in the outdoors to how you're going to prepare. So think about things like hay storage and generator locations. Are they in low-lying areas that are likely to be affected in the floodwaters when you need them the most? Think about things like tree limbs or brushy growth that might be fire fuel, for example, and think about those hazards in your general preparation and planning. Trailers, do you have one? Is it in working order? How many animals can fit in the trailer? If that is less than the number of animals you own, how many trips would it take to get your animals packed up? So there's a lot of things to think about with trailers, so make sure you include them in your planning. Also have a kit for the barn to help shelter in place. Depending on the scale of the disaster and the number of animals we're talking about, oftentimes it may be preferable to shelter in place when possible. Just make sure you have the things on site that you need if you were going to do that. So horses have a readily accessible halter and lead. It's very common to not be in the same place as your horse when the disaster occurs. So it's very helpful to have a buddy system, somebody who can be there or come in and feed or do things, do some of the care items that you can't do because you're unavailable. May also help with the trailering aspect too, if that's not a resource that you have. Identification options. There are some good ones for horses. You can get these little tags for their collars. Some of them that not collar, excuse me, halter. Some of them that look like little scrolls that you can put on their halter and then you unfurl with all their information. And then there are things you can do to put the ID on the animal. So livestock paints and markers. I've seen non-toxic spray paints with a stencil with your phone number used. A note about writing. So one thing that I've seen commonly is recommendation to put your phone number on the hoof with like a Sharpie marker. That can work. I will say in many disasters where they're probably walking through wet or muddy terrain, that might be not a very long lasting option. So it's probably ideal to have something higher up. The one thing I like to recommend is to reimagine mundane or regular circumstances as ways to practice your evacuation and preparedness things. So if you're going on a trail ride, if you're going to any point sporting events, think about what you have in your trailer. Do you have everything you need to get them loaded quickly? What could you add or improve on so that if it was a disaster situation instead of a fun situation, do you really have everything you need and how can you refine that? So a couple examples. So this is a Go trailer or Go kit, my friend's horse trailer. So it has some buckets, some hay bags, extra lead ropes, and a first aid kit that's ready to grab and go. This is another horse kit for an older pony who has a lot of supplements and a few meds. So you see those sort of pre-portioned and ready to grab and go. Also has a little headlamp, which is very helpful, especially if you're out in the barn and the power's gone out. Thermometer and some spare batteries. Ruminants and swine. I'm going to include camelids in the ruminant category, even though they're technically pseudo-ruminant. They're variably trailer savvy. If we're talking about frequently handled 4-H pets, they probably trailer reasonably well, but some of these that are more extensively managed may hardly ever see a trailer, maybe get on a trailer once in their life. So think ahead to catch areas and having extra panels to help direct them in that kind of scenario when you need to move them. Take advantage of herd dynamics. most farms I've been on have one bottle raised animal or mascot animal that's unusually friendly with everybody. Take advantage of the trainability of that animal to train that one to the trailer and hopefully use their sort of herd mentality to guide others. Swine are especially heat sensitive, so if we're talking about wildfires and summer disasters, factor that into the timing of when you load and move them. And similar to the horses, if you're gathering up the flock or herd for something like routine deworming or foot care, think about how that's going, how you can optimize your setup, and how it might be a little different in a disaster scenario. Poultry, so high pathogenic avian influenza is a big issue in a lot of the country right now, and that may limit your evacuation options. So think ahead, have multiple options, multiple plans, because you may find yourself having to pivot a little. So be prepared to shelter in place. There are a number of different approaches to temporary housing because of their small size. Sometimes they're treated more like small animals where you have small numbers or individuals in smaller kennels. Some folks will use a large animal approach where you basically net off a stall and put the entire flock in there. So there's a few different ways to approach it with their pros and cons. And leg bands can be helpful for identification, leg bands like a phone number. Hopefully you're feeling more inspired than overwhelmed. I know this is a lot of information fairly fast. If you're thinking, wow, this is a lot, where do I even start? My advice or my encouragement is just start with something really simple. Agree among your family who would be your out of area contact, who would be like the first family member out of the area you guys talk to, something like that. And just chip away because it's all cumulative. Every little thing you do all adds up to the greater preparedness effort. So start small. And as promised, lots of resources. The AVMA, Red Cross, Red Rover have great small animal preparedness things. This CDC Healthy Pets website I like very well for the planning portion. They do a very good job of setting up sort of a stepwise planning piece that I like. Large animals, AVMA also has a large animal, AVMA being the American Veterinary Medical Association has large animal as well as a small animal piece. And then we have a number of different sort of ag focused resources as well. All right. With that, I'll open it up for some questions.
I'll start with one from the chat, and then we'll, if you have one in house, just raise your hand. And if you can kind of repeat the question for those online, that'd be great. First question was, how much water information do you have to stock for dogs and cats? Humans are 1 gallon, but I can't find that. So any advice on kind of water for humans?
Yeah, so it's going to be a little bit variable, right? So your Chihuahua is probably not going to need as much as your Saint Bernard, for example. So I generally tell people use the human number as your rough rule of thumb and scale down. So your large dog will probably be very similar to what a human will need. Your smaller cats and dogs, less. Maybe think half a gallon. You know, even that's probably a little generous, but probably better to have too much than too little.
We'll have a microchip question. I heard that microchips only work with designated companies or situations. They're a national microchip database. Can you talk us through a little bit more about how that actually works on the back end?
Yeah. So there are a couple of different microchip frequencies that are commonly used. Many veterinary clinics and shelters have what are called universal scanners. So the ability to read the chip is pretty widespread. It's very rare that you come across a chip that you just can't read or that's not detected with the common universal scanners. Where it's tricky on the back end is that there isn't a universal national registry for chips. The American Animal Hospital Association has a chip database that kind of aggregates a number of different ones, and that helps. But you still have to be individually registered with the company that's associated with your microchip. And there's a lot of different companies that do that, and a lot of different companies that have different policies in terms of registering and updating and whether or not it costs to update, etc. I will say there are a few different free registries that are not affiliated with a microchip company. Some of those feed into that AHA database or that AHA registry. So if for some reason you're unable or unwilling to do it through the chip company, try to find one of those free databases that feeds into that larger American Animal Hospital Association registry.
So with the emergency opinion, the way to tell, I guess, what could be not consistent in what they have, would be to take for the vet and get it here. And how, I mean, I don't think it's probably something, but how do you actually go in and update the info?
Sure.
Repeat that, Roman.
Yeah. So to repeat that, how do you know which company the microchip is registered to if you've lost track of that information for one reason or another? So when you scan the chip, you can put it into that same registry database. And based on the first, if it's an Avid chip, it's really easy because Avid like pops up as part of the scanning. For other companies, it's based on their sort of numeric prefix. And so when you enter the number in that registry lookup, it will tell you who it's likely registered with, and you can follow up with the individual company. And again, that's another place where you might look into using the free registries. If it's been, like I have a 16-year-old pit bull mix, and I'm a paperwork hoarder, and so I have, all of her records going back to forever. But if I didn't, it might be pretty hard to go back and find like the adoption record that had the chip number and the chip registration. That might be a scenario where it's useful to use those free registries to just get it into a database somewhere that was searchable, so that if you wanted to continue chasing it down, at least there's something in the system that could be found and associated with you and your pet.
Question, what do you suggest about like rotating your stash and rotating, foods out of date, medication, things like that? So
Yeah.
I feel like they're in the chat.
Yeah. So the question was about like perishable items as part of your go kit, and food and meds and things that expire. How do you stay optimally prepared while not relying on expired things? And that's a great question. One of the best approaches I've heard from, I think it's what the state vet does. When he came and talked to us, he said, instead of having a go bag, I have a go area. I have a region of my house where there's shelving, and those things are there. They're rotated through, and it's in a convenient place for sort of one-stop shopping if I needed to quickly aggregate it into a bag. But it's not tucked away in a bag somewhere where it's going to expire and be forgotten. And that's a good way to go. I kind of do somewhat of a hybrid system personally, where I have a packed go bag that has the non-perishable or slow to perish items, and then have an area that's the food, the medications, that's all in a centralized location if I needed to grab it quickly.
Medication questions. One is you're trying to evacuate like multiple animals, dogs in this case. It's a good question that don't get along very well, but you have limited space. Is it okay to medicate those animals in evacuation? And then the second question was, can you get extra medications prescribed in order to supply in your first aid kit? So kind of a two-parter.
Yes.
One about moving and one about being prepared.
Yes. So the questions are medicating pets for moving if they're easily stressed. And for that part, It'll be a little bit of a judgment call. Every pet's behavioral quirks are a little bit different. So think about, I mean, fireworks season is coming up. Think about how your pet handles fireworks and how they respond to their medication. I know I have a fireworks phobic dog. When they take their anti-anxiety meds, it takes the edge off, but they're not totally zonked. And so I feel pretty comfortable giving that in that kind of emergency scenario. The concern would be if they're at a plane of sedation where they're not managing their body temperature as well, or unable to respond to the challenging or changing circumstances around them, then it may be more of a hindrance than a help. You'll have to remind me the second part of that question. There was the.
It's about, can you get extra medication?
Oh,
prescribed
yes.
by your vet,
Thank you.
to your kid.
Yes, extra medication. So yeah, that's something to talk with your veterinarian about. I think if you tell them the context that this is for disaster planning and preparedness, for a lot of we're talking eye drops or, really medications that aren't controlled, then that's probably pretty easy to do. The other thing is to think about refilling before you're empty, refill when you're starting to get empty, or, it's at half or as soon as it can be refilled, rather than waiting until the last minute, which this is one of those do as I say, not as I do. I'm terrible about this, but that's one way that you can start to kind of build a little bit of a backstock of extra medication is by reordering in a faster fashion.
Question about, kind of if you're not able to evacuate all of your large animals, what should you have prepared in the barn kit? You kind of mentioned if you have a shelter in place, so just general tips about sheltering in place and you prepare for that.
Yeah, great question. So yeah, the question, in case the online audience couldn't hear it, if you have to evacuate your large animals, but you only get some of them out and there's still a cohort left at the barn that needs to be attended to, what should you do with them? Similar sort of, and then again, I'll refer you to the resources where they can give you sort of a more thorough packing list. But the care instructions will be really helpful too. You can describe briefly in a couple pages what those animals will need so that the first responders or whoever is able to go back into the scene first. If it's some sort of animal response team, they have some instructions and know what to do, and then have the things there to do it. So if they're eating hay, or if they have supplements or concentrates, that those things are as accessible as they can be without posing a hazard themselves, so that they don't have to search for them and label things well. Because you have to imagine they're probably well-meaning volunteers, but they may have, great horse experience, but haven't touched a goat in years, or, so they may be a little bit out of their comfort zone. So whatever you can do to make it easy for them should pay dividends.
Just the last couple of questions, then we'll wrap it up. Would you prepare a kit for different seasons, or generally kind of applicable across the board?
Yeah, so the question was, do you prepare multiple kits, one for each sort of season? And I will say I try to do sort of an all hazards approach. I have a base kit that doesn't focus on any particular hazard, and then know that there might be accessories. And the other, this kind of gets back to the question a bit about the perishables. I have my kit. I also have my packing list. So even though I try to keep my perishables in a relatively central location so they'd be quick to grab, having that packing list helps you sort of check off the accessories you want to add to your go kit at the last minute. And that's where I consider adding certain seasonal items, or if you live in a region where the hazards you face in one season are extremely different from the ones you face in another, write 2 different packing lists. And that'll be easy, but I'd probably work on a base kit, and then give yourself some latitude for addition if you need it.
And this last one, do you have any tips for evacuating guardian dogs? So, curious.
Yeah, and I will confess I don't have a whole lot of personal experience working with dogs in that context. And that's where I probably search those livestock resources a little more closely. That can be a little bit challenging because I think that there's opposing forces, right? They want to stay with their livestock. Evacuation and personnel, response personnel may try to funnel them in with the companion dogs, and realistically, they're probably more suited to stay with their livestock if possible. And so this is one of those circumstances where I just try to prepare a little in advance, or if you live in a region where there's where that guardian livestock dog situation is common, see what your other neighbors and farms have done if they've needed to move those dogs, and how best to keep them calm while moving the livestock.
Online folks, share last resources.
Sure.
In the case of horses in a wildfire situation, say you're in stage 3 and you can't get all the horses out, or you let them out protected. I've heard it said that one of the things you probably should do is just let them out. Not put them in a barn where they're gonna burn.
Yeah, and so you might want to allow them access to get out of the barn, or not have them in the barn. But a word of caution to let them out to the larger, you'd still probably want to move them to a pasture, an area where they're still contained, but they have some latitude to get away or choose the safest ground to be on. When you start talking about cutting fences and letting them go, there's a lot of other considerations where if there's absolutely no other choice, it might be an option, but it creates a lot of hazards for responders, those animals that used to be in a pen or maybe now on the road while people are trying to evacuate and that sort of thing. So it's never going to be an easy choice when you're faced with those kind of decisions, but try to think about the holistic emergency response. Yeah, and so in the preparing plan, think about is there a pasture you can make defensible, or what pasture is going to be the safest in a wildfire because it's the farthest from where a likely crown fire would be able to establish, where you can clear away the brush, where there's most likely to be standing water even later into the season, where they could maybe where it wouldn't be quite as flammable. So, and that might be something where your local practitioner, if they come out for a farm visit, might be able to kind of help you identify spaces and fine tune the setup. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. I thank you all online for being with us as well. I'm going to share a few resources so that you have those, and then we'll close down for the day. All right. So I just want to make everyone aware, this is the contact information for our teaching hospital. If you have any specific questions about your animals and would like to make an appointment or anything like that. This is for the small animal clinic. We also have our large animal number on our website, which I forgot to add to the slides, so my apologies. If you have event feedback or questions, please contact us at vet.editor@oregonstate.edu. And then myself, Jens Odegaard, and Anna Justice were monitoring the chat. So if you'd like to reach out to us personally, you can get us at these links. For all of the resources that were mentioned today, including our handout that was given out here in person, but is available as a downloadable PDF you can go to vetmed.oregonstate.edu/FURst Aid. And we'll also have all of the information about our future events there. Finally, this is how to follow us on social media and stay in touch with us. So thank you all for being with us today. And we're going to go ahead and close down the webinar, and we will make this recording available on our FURst Aid website as well. So thank you all.